Hello everyone, and welcome to today's lesson about Captain John Smith of Jamestown. This is Unit 1, and it is Lesson 1, and it is of course a video lecture. We are starting our Great Men of America series off at the very beginning of American history, with the founding of the first English settlement on American soil, which is known as Jamestown. John Smith is most known for being the president of Jamestown, and he has very famous, now mythologized interactions with Pocahontas. There are many movies today that have John Smith in the role of this president, and it has kind of solidified his status as a legend in American history. Jamestown was founded in 1607. It is located along the James River in modern-day Virginia. We are going to learn about the history of Jamestown, among other things, through the perspective of John Smith. Jamestown is the most famous and notable part of John Smith's life, but he did do a lot of other interesting things throughout his lifespan that'll influence the leader he would become in Virginia. My goal is not to overwhelm you with names and dates in this lesson, but to start off, I am going to do a rapid-fire timeline to get you caught up on where we are in American history and to put John Smith in his proper context. I thought this was appropriate to do because this is the first lesson we're doing, and then after this, it'll be going in order. John Smith was born in 1580, and of course Jamestown, I already said, starts in 1607. So those are the years we're trying to build up to, but here are some important dates that happened before then. First important date we have is 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. America is discovered, and the Spanish, who funded Christopher Columbus's journey, got a head start claiming and colonizing all this territory in the Americas. And then, about 30 years later, in the 1520s, Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztecs. This shows the quick progress the Spanish are making and becoming this world superpower, and they now have access to all these resources, all this gold. And England has not even started their colonization process yet. As Cortez and the Spanish are colonizing Central America, in Germany, which is known as the Holy Roman Empire at this point, in 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 theses in critiquing the Roman Catholic Church. This leads to what's known as the Protestant Reformation, and this directly leads to England becoming a Protestant country. Now, Protestant means they are Christian, but they are not Roman Catholic. And in England, thanks to a large part of Henry VIII, there's a whole story that goes with this that I won't go into, they become known as the Church of England, and pretty much everyone in England is a part of the Church of England. And the reason why that's important is John Smith is born and baptized as a baby in the Protestant Christian Church through the Church of England. So he is a Christian. Today, we call them Anglican, but back then it's called the Church of England, and that's probably what I'll call them anytime they come up in the future of this series. The last important date I have to mention is the printing press was invented about the 1440s, and it arrived in England around the 1480s. But it's just because there's one printing press doesn't mean there's instantly a ton of books. It takes a while to get these books printed and produced, so books are very expensive at this point, and reading and writing are taught to very few children during this time. So it's a symbol of status if you can read, write, and if you own a big library, then you're probably very rich. All right, that's enough of the setup. Let's begin the story of John Smith. John Smith was born in 1580 in Lincolnshire. To my American audience, that is on the east coast of England, kind of in the middle of Britain, north of London. John Smith's parents were yeoman farmers. That is a term we don't use today, but it means they are above the rank of peasants, but they are below the rank of gentlemen and nobility. They had a lord of their land who owned the land, but his parents were the tenant farmers who were in charge of a particular section of it. The lord of the land funded John Smith's early schooling and even let him shadow a wealthy merchant for a while. So already he is the product of people being generous to him. However, John Smith was not interested in this life even as a kid. Maybe the news of the era may have influenced him growing up. During his childhood, he would have heard stories of the lost colony of Roanoke, the first English settlement in America that ended in failure. Also, England was at war with Spain. where a lot of conflict was fought at sea and in the Americas. One now famous Englishman, Sir Francis Drake, robbed the Spanish for treasure and sailed all the way around the world to return to England. The Lord of the Land, that helped fund his education, even left for a while to go fight against the Spanish. So all of these events are going to be influencing John Smith in his childhood, and it's kind of creating this big sense of adventure in his brain, and he is very aware of that. While he was schooling and dreaming of such adventures, tragedy struck. His father died before he was 16 years old. Now, according to John Smith's writings, he said both parents died, and the biography I read said his mother quickly remarried and moved to a different estate, so it's not very clear there. But regardless, he never mentions his mother again. So she would no longer be an influence on his life, and his father, like I said, is dead as well. As tragic as this was, John Smith did have a newfound freedom at the age of 17, and he immediately stopped his life of yeoman farming and went to go serve a captain in a war that was happening in the Netherlands. He told very little about his experience, but this phase in his life lasted about 3 years before he returned to his lord's land in Britain. Next, Smith went on a brief trip to France with his lord's 2 sons. He quickly had to return, but on his way back he met a nobleman who had Smith deliver a letter to King James of Scotland. And King James of Scotland, he will be an important figure later on. On his way back, he had a brief shipwreck, but despite that setback, he delivers the letter to the king and returns home to his lord's land. At this point in his life, he takes some time to read some books, most likely loaned to him by his lord. He read Marcus Aurelius and The Art of War by Machiavelli. The Art of War book will play a big influence in gaining connections, as we will shortly see. Also, with this brief pause in Smith's life, he is visited by an Italian horse rider who helps train John Smith in horse riding and sword fighting and behaving like a nobleman. And according to our best evidence, it seems like this is once again just out of the generosity of the Italian. So maybe John Smith is just someone who has a fun personality to be around, easy to get along with, and these people are drawn to him and are very generous. Next, we move on to Smith's next phase in life, which is his years being a mercenary. A mercenary is a soldier who is hired, so a soldier that is there to get paid. And he is going to be a mercenary fighting the Turks. The Turks are from what we now call Turkey, south of Greece and above the Middle East. In the days of John Smith, it was called the Ottoman Empire. Like today, it still is, and it was back then, a Muslim empire. These Muslims waged war against the Christians in Eastern Europe for many centuries. John Smith says, "I was desirous to see more of the world and try my fortune against the Turks, both lamenting and repenting to have seen so many Christians slaughter one another." As noble as his goals were, it turned out to be quite the difficulty to get to Eastern Europe to fight the Turks. He set off from England with 4 men who quickly robbed him of all his belongings and left him stranded in France. He did run into one of these men and did a brief sword fight with him, but learned that that guy had also been betrayed by the other 3 guys, and he was just as poor as John Smith was. But regardless, he was able to continue on his journey because, once again, the generosity of a nobleman who took him under his wing, gave him some money, got him on a boat to sail to Eastern Europe. And then, once again, he's going to run into more difficulty. So this is kind of the trend of John Smith's life. He will have very good luck to very bad luck very quickly. The boat got stuck off the coast of France due to poor weather, and most of the travels on the boat were Roman Catholic, and they believed that God would not allow the boat to move until the Protestant John Smith was purged from the ship. So they toss him overboard, where he was stranded on an island, only for about a day because there were some other ships stopped there as well, and then he is luckily picked up by this other ship. The captain of this new ship found his story very entertaining, which is understandable, and eventually the captain drops John Smith off in the Balkans, right where John Smith was trying to get to. The Balkans is like that area in Greece, which is where the Turks would be fighting. John Smith was gifted quite a bit of money by this ship captain, once again, good luck, and decided to do some sightseeing in Italy and Rome before becoming a mercenary. So he saw the Pope, traveled around to famous Italian cities, and then went into Germany, which, like I said, was the Holy Roman Empire at this time, and officially became a mercenary. He could have fallen into the ranks as an average soldier and been killed off or fallen into obscurity with the hundreds of other soldiers in this unit. But instead, his time as mercenary grew his rank and social status. He had a few tricks up his sleeve that he gladly shared with his commanders that he had learned by reading The Art of War by Machiavelli. First, he had learned a lantern signal, like a secret code that could effectively coordinate sneak attacks on the Turkish army through long distances. The next trick that John Smith learned was the art of pyrotechnics, which is like fire bombs. He knew how to make fire bombs out of pots. He used these to sow death and terror behind the walls of the fortress they were attacking. Here's a quote on that attack. "Simple slings were made, and when the time came, the pots were ignited and lobbed over the city. It was midnight, and Smith says that it was a fearful sight to see the short flaming course of their flight in the air, and that when they had fallen, the lamentable noise of the slaughtered Turks was the most wonderful to hear." So a little brutal, but shows that he is being very effective in this army. Due to his contributions to the success of the Christian army, John Smith got his promotion to the title he is famously called today, Captain John Smith. After this, John Smith probably has his most wild experience. He continues as a mercenary, and for a while, they are laying siege to a town in Romania that is under the control of the Turks. A siege is where you are surrounding a city and you wait for them to surrender, or you're waiting to build your siege works or whatever to properly attack the city. And it was taking a long time. The Turks inside the city were getting a little bored, so they challenged a Christian to a duel. And John Smith was chosen by the Christian army to represent the Christians in this duel. So it's a one-on-one duel, but unlike in the Christian countries, there's going to be a bit less chivalry in this duel because the winner is decided when they cut the head off their opponent. Pretty brutal. So walking into this, it is a fight to the death no matter what. Now, I will let John Smith tell you about this duel. I abridged or translated a little bit of this into modern English because some of the words were quite large, but here is what Smith writes. "Truce between the two armies were made, the ramparts all filled with fair ladies and soldiers. The Christian army formed a battle array outside the walls. The Turk entered the field well mounted and armed. On his soldiers were a pair of great wings, composed of eagle feathers, with a silver ridge, richly garnished with gold and precious stones. Another Muslim bore his lance, another led his horse. I only had a page bearing my lance. I passed by him with a courteous salute. At the sound of the trumpet, I charged and passed the Turk through the sight of his face guard, face, head, and all, that he fell dead to the ground, where, alighting and unembracing his helmet, I cut off his head, and the Turks took his body." Now, the action will not stop there because the Turk had a friend who wanted to avenge his death, and very soon Smith found himself in a second duel where I'll once again let Smith tell the story. As before, the sound of the trumpets, our lances, broke in pieces upon a clear run. The Turk was almost unhorsed but managed to stay on. Our pistols were next, which struck me upon my breastplate. But I shot the Turk and wounded his left arm, that being not able to rule his horse and defend himself, he was thrown to the ground, and so bruised with a fall that he lost his head, as his friend before him had. And then, once again, the action does not stop there, because now John Smith was making a name for himself and he wanted to continue to build up his reputation. He shouted to the Muslim fortress to send down another soldier to duel, and they provided. Here is an account of the third and final duel with a Turk. The next day, both the champions entered the field as before. We did not have lances, so we each discharged our pistol. Both shots missed. Battle axes were next, whose blades made sometimes me or sometimes my opponent too scarce to keep in our saddles. I received such a blow that I lost my battle axe and almost fell trying to recover it. The supposing conquering Turk had a great shout from the ramparts. The Turk made use of his advantage, but due to the readiness of my horse, and my judgment and dexterity beyond all men's expectation, and by God's assistance, I not only avoided the Turk's violence, but drew my sword and pierced the Turk under the armor plates through the back of his body, that although he got off his horse and stood, not long before he lost his head. Finally, the siege works and weapons were ready, and the Christians successfully took the castle. After the battle, there was a service held to give thanks to the Almighty God and to recognize the heroes of the battle. John Smith was among one of the recognized. The Emperor of Transylvania, who John Smith was serving under, gave him permission to create a coat of arms. A coat of arms is a symbol typically painted on a shield to signify your family name, nobility, or title. John Smith, creating his own, meant he was not a gentleman, but he had worked his way up in society and would no longer be seen as a yeoman or a tenant farmer. And here is John Smith's coat of arms. It is quite brutal because he chose to show the 3 Muslim heads he cut off to earn his title. Most medieval arms are not as gruesome in their symbolism. He now had the title of captain, a great monetary reward for becoming a gentleman, you could say, and a new status, which means it is time for something to go wrong for John Smith. He has had too much good luck lately. A few months later, he is in a battle against the Turks where they are greatly outnumbered. John Smith once again used his fire bombs to help them retreat, which helped them temporarily, but they were too far away from reinforcements and they had to stand and face the enemy. It was a hard-fought battle. At one point, the Christians used sharpened stakes to impale the Muslim cavalry, but eventually the Christians lost the battle. John Smith was lucky because he now had expensive armor and a coat of arms, which proved he was a man of value. So he was not executed, and instead they sold him into slavery. He was sold to a young woman in a rich family from Istanbul. That was the former capital of the Eastern Roman Empire until the Ottoman Empire captured it and renamed it from Constantinople to Istanbul. Here, with the young woman, it was implied that if he would convert to Islam, he would be granted a high status and maybe even marry the woman. But before any of that could happen, the young woman loaned him to her brother because she was not old enough to do anything with John Smith. So he was shipped across the Black Sea to be a slave on a farm that he was now a very long way from home, and he was treated very poorly by this brother. At one point, he was left alone with his brother, and here's what John Smith writes: "He took occasion so to beat, spurn, and revile me, and I, forgetting all reason, beat out the man's brains with a threshing bat, and seeing his estate could be no worse than it was, clothed myself in his clothes, hid his body under the straw, filled my knapsack with corn, mounted his horse, and ran to the desert at all adventure." So his time as a slave was short-lived, and he began his very long journey back to England. 2 notable things happened on his way home. First, he found the emperor that gave him his honors, so he could prove to the English that he actually earned his spot as a gentleman. Second, he got on a French ship that engaged in piracy against the Spanish. He probably did not mind stealing from the Spanish because they were enemies of England, but in the future he would write a significant amount against the pirates. So he was not a fan of piracy. He thought it was very barbaric, and he recommended that people not do it anymore. But he did engage in it just a little bit on his way back to England. So he makes it back to England, where he will begin a new type of adventure, the colonization of the Americas. Smith was around 24 years old when he got back, and he would be 27 when he took off to Virginia and Jamestown. One very important thing that happened while he was gone was King James, the King of Scotland, became king of all England and Scotland, uniting the 2 countries. This King James is also famous for funding the King James translation of the Bible, called the KJV, but most importantly for our story, this King James approved colonial expansion into the Americas, the first English king to do it and be successful with it. England tried to start a colony in Roanoke 30 years earlier, the now lost colony of Roanoke. If you have never heard of that, I will post something about that in my mini lessons, but the title should let you know that as a lost colony, it was not very successful. John Smith, once again, was guided by having good connections with important people. His former lord was connected to people in charge of the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company was the English organization that laid claim to the land in America. It is important to note that King James approved the colony of Jamestown, and that is how Jamestown gets its name. King James, Jamestown. However, King James only approved the colony. The Virginia Company planned and funded the entire trip. The Virginia Company got its money by investors, An investment is where you spend money on something in hopes it gives you more money in the future. So all the rich people who paid for Jamestown were hoping to make money on it down the road. This right here is why Jamestown, as we are soon going to see, is going to have such a rough start in the early years as the colony, because they are so focused on finding wealth rather than building a new colony. And if you're not focusing on survival, a lot of people are going to die. John Smith is someone who opposes that mindset, but we'll get to that. First, on the journey to Virginia, aboard the ship there, Smith was accused of mutiny. Mutiny would now mean trying to overthrow the captain and take over the ship. John Smith didn't go that far. He just liked to get into arguments with the leaders of the expedition, and they did not really view him as a true gentleman, so they didn't like him critiquing their decisions very much. So this led to him being restrained for almost half the journey, which the whole journey took over 3 months of sea travel to get there. One leader tried to have him hanged, but the other leaders did not think his crimes were that serious, even if they didn't like him very much. He was set free when they arrived at the location in modern-day Virginia where Jamestown would be built. Once they arrived, they opened a locked box that had a list of names the Virginia Company back in England wrote down of these are going to be the 7 people that are in charge of the colony. And John Smith's name was on there. So the people of the Virginia Company trusted John Smith to be one of the 7 highest ranking people. And to give a broad overview, there's about 105 men in Jamestown. 50 were English gentlemen, 50 were laborers or servants. So there was stiff competition for John Smith earning a spot in the top 7. So they have arrived in Jamestown. John Smith is in a position of leadership, but immediately things start going wrong. For months, nobody even built houses. Nobody went out hunting because the gentlemen were too proud to work and the servants have to be forced to work, and the gentlemen were too lazy to even force them to work. So the reason they were like this is because they knew England was going to be sending them supplies every so often. So why would we work for food when it's just going to arrive by boat? John Smith writes, "The men would rather starve and rot with idleness than be persuaded to do anything for their own relief without constraint." John Smith himself was not involved in this culture of laziness. He knew that those supplies from England would not arrive very reliably. He turned into the primary explorer for the town. Not that you can actually call it a town, because there was hardly any buildings there. He traded Indian tribes for corn. The only thing keeping them from starvation was him trading with the Indians for food. And he was exploring the territory, trying to find anything of value, because if they could, say, find gold, people back in London would swarm to Virginia, and if you have a lot more people, it would just naturally thrive more. During one of these trips, his entire crew was slaughtered by Indians. That followed the chief leader known as King Powhatan. Pretty much all the Indians within contact range of Jamestown were in a small way ruled by this big chief Powhatan. And as their prisoner, Smith was kidnapped around 3 weeks, and he had to use his wits to make himself seem as important and powerful as possible so that they would not kill him. Finally, the tribe dropped him off to meet the leader, Powhatan, and here is the most famous scene from John Smith's life. Powhatan in their hut tent with everyone around them. Powhatan tells him that in 4 days he will be a free man. This sounds like good news, but after a long conversation, John Smith begins to think he has upset them, because they yank him from the tent, force his head onto a big rock, grab another very large rock, and presumably they are going to drop the rock on his head and smash his brains in. However, an unlikely ally comes to the rescue, Pocahontas, who is a 10-year-old princess. She is the daughter of Chief Powhatan. She enters for the first time in these stories, screams at her father to stop the execution, and then she laid her head on top of Smith so that the rock could not be dropped. The Chief Powhatan relents to this 10-year-old daughter and allows John Smith to live. Not only that, but he adopts John Smith as his own son, and by this he means like he's going to be like a chief. He promises to give Smith food and free land, and says to treat him as one of the tribe, and as promised from the beginning, 4 days later he was set free to go back to the village along with a supply of Indian corn. The rest of the winter, John Smith stayed at Jamestown awaiting next year's spring adventures. Now, Jamestown has been around for about an entire year, which is a good sign. They have survived a year. But how is it actually going? Jamestown is built like a fort. It has a wooden palisade of trees, or it's like a wall that goes around. And there's a church, there's a storeroom, and a couple houses. Yes, they did finally build some houses before the winter, but the culture of laziness was still very much alive. They had a small farm for growing corn outside the walls, but they still had to rely on supplies coming from Britain because the farm was not enough to keep them alive. And the supplies from Britain, as John Smith predicted, were coming very seldomly. So John Smith, doing his diplomatic missions trading Indians for corn, was saving the colony from starvation. In the summer, a lot of colonists died from disease, and the winter was rough also because they had very little food, so they would die of starvation. The numbers of the colony were dwindling. At one point, it got down to 38 members alive. The only way the number of colonists increased was by the supply shipments, and the first supply shipment would bring in around 80 new colonists. So Jamestown almost became extinct multiple times. It was so close to being abandoned multiple times. Many times, John Smith was one of those 7 counselors who refused to pack everything up and go home. And as you can imagine, John Smith does not get along with these other 6 leaders, and there is still a lot of friction and hostility towards him. So in turn, John Smith gets sent on a lot of exploration missions because they want to sit around and do nothing, and he can't force them to do anything if he's out exploring. So John Smith makes the best of his exploration missions. He explores up the James River as well as the entire Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay is where Washington, D.C. will eventually be constructed. So John Smith was probably the first white man to walk over the land of our future capital of America. He was supposed to be looking for gold, but he doubted the existence of a gold mine in Virginia, so instead he was looking for a water passage across North America, meaning he was trying to see if you could go by river from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. I will talk more about this when we get into Lewis and Clark, because they are still looking for that water route across North America 200 years later. And a bit of a spoiler, the reason John Smith cannot find it is because it does not exist. But regardless, he still found plenty of ore mines, which he was very excited about. No one else was, because the Virginia Company only wanted gold, but he's like, hey, this is still useful. He also made relations with all the Indians in those areas. Outside the power of Chief Powhatan, some of the Indians were more aggressive, so he got in plenty of small skirmishes, but he never lost a soldier. Some of these Indian tribes outside the rule of Powhatan were much less developed without the protection of Powhatan, and some of them didn't even have farms or crops, and they only relied on hunting and fishing. Hence, they were not very powerful tribes he was going against. John Smith would wear his full suit of armor, and his soldiers would wear these like really thick poncho type overcoats, and they were definitely probably hot, especially in the Virginia summers, but they were very thick. And the weak Indian arrows, these aren't like the English longbows, these are a lot more primitive. The arrows couldn't even penetrate their clothes or John Smith's armor, of course. They also fitted their boat with iron plates, so John Smith and his 20 men could repulse attacks of 200 or more Indians without even a single loss. They just shoot their muskets a few times, and the Indians would run away, and that would be a skirmish. Like 1 or 2 Indians would die per skirmish. Not exactly the most brutal battles. Now, in September of 1608, it was time to re-elect who would be president of Jamestown. 1 counselor who disliked Smith had died. 2 had just quit and gone home. Another was captain of the resupply ship who was away doing a resupply at this time. So with that being said, John Smith was finally elected president because all the people that hated him were no longer around. And he instantly turns the colony around for the better. He improved the quality of guard duty so they wouldn't be ambushed by the Indians. In the spring, he increased the amount of crops that were planted. This gave them more food. He started industries to create things like glass to be traded with Indians or sent back to London for money. So that way, Jamestown wasn't just relying entirely on the Virginia Company. Overall, he motivated the colonists to actually be productive and, build a town. Smith received orders from the Virginia Company to crown Chief Powhatan as king, which is kind of an interesting thing to do. Smith always disagreed with the Virginia Company's orders involving Indians because their orders were always to be overly generous. where from experience, John Smith knew you have to be tough with these Indians, and if you were too nice to them, they will take your kindness as weakness, which is why Smith was always so successful in his Indian diplomacy. So Smith obviously did not like this plan to crown the chief Indian king in a European-style ceremony. The purpose of the plan was to stress that Powhatan had power, but he was a lesser king and he had to serve King James back in England. Not a great plan. Despite not liking the plan, John Smith did do the ceremony and anointed the chief in a kingly ceremony. They gave him a golden crown and entirely English robes, so he wasn't dressed in his Indian garments anymore. And immediately after receiving the British crown, Chief Powhatan became more hostile to the Jamestown colonists. He told all the tribes under his dominion to refuse all trade with John Smith and the English. So once again, John Smith proven right. They give him power, and he takes it as weakness on behalf of the English. Had this been the following year, it may have not been the worst thing to happen. But John Smith only became president in September, so they had very little crops and food because his increased crops had not produced food yet. He had very little crops and foods to last the winter. And then to make things worse, the food stores got wet and became moldy, so that winter and spring they would have very little rations. This could have been fatal to the still weak colony, but John Smith managed to survive. He did this by traveling to the Indians that had attacked them in the previous months and told them, hey, you tried to kill us, you have to give us some of your food supplies or else we are going to kill you. And that was a pretty good strategy. A lot of the Indian tribes ended up giving him corn. Then Chief Powhatan heard about their exploits and offered them a ton of food if they would build him a house in the English style and give him a ton of guns. John Smith sort of accepted this offer. He sent 10 men to go build a house, but never planned on giving the Indians guns because that was their only advantage in fighting the Indians, was their superior technology. So this is where it starts to get very complicated and a lot of stuff happens all at once. But at the same time, this is pretty much John Smith's finale at Jamestown, so it makes sense that he's going to end his time out there with a bang. So hold on, it's going to get a little complicated. The 10 men that Smith sent to Powhatan were Dutch and Polish, not English, so they did not feel extremely loyal to the English Jamestown after eating good Indian food with Chief Powhatan every night, so they decide to betray John Smith in Jamestown. So when John Smith went to Powhatan to barter for the food that Powhatan had promised him, Powhatan had 10 Europeans on his side and decided to betray John Smith now that he was feeling more confident. So John Smith, one night while he was staying there, his tent was surrounded by Indians. John Smith and his friend fought his way out with their pistols, killing a few Indians along the way, escaping on a boat. Little did Smith know this would be the last time he ever saw Powhatan. All this happened as negotiations were ongoing, so John Smith did not gather his much needed food. So he went upstream to a tribe that was led by Powhatan's brother, and their negotiations were also tense because John Smith did not realize how much he had been betrayed. He thought it was just like a few Indians that were wanting to kill him on their own. All of Powhatan's dominions were not restrained from killing the English anymore. Powhatan had given them full permission to kill the English. However, it's a lot harder to kill an Englishman than they realize. John Smith had been holding himself back for 2 years now, playing nice with the Indians. Now they tried poisoning his food and killing him in his sleep once again. So Smith finally goes scorched earth on the Indians. He burns down their huts, he raids their food. Granted, he doesn't kill very many Indians because anytime the Indians hear gunshots, they just all run away. Also, he would still leave trinkets behind to show that he wasn't all that mean. He'd leave them like little beads and stuff that they liked to show that, hey, I'm just getting revenge for what you did to me, but we can have better relations in the future if you fix your ways. While John Smith was doing these small Indian battles, a man from Jamestown caught up to him. It was quite impressive that he made it past Powhatan's camp, and he said he only survived because Pocahontas sheltered him in her camp and provided him safe passage. So another Pocahontas cameo there. But the reason he urgently had to see Smith was to tell him the news that all the leaders of Jamestown went on a boat ride to Hog Island to get food, hogs, obviously, but they shipwrecked and all died. It was 2 leaders and 7 other gentlemen. John Smith then returned to Jamestown, and he was the only member of the original 7 counselors still alive or still in Virginia. So, the silver lining to this tragedy was Smith could become the tyrant the colony needed. The year before Smith was president, 60% of the colony died. The year that Smith was president, only 20% of the colony died, and Smith wanted to improve that number even more now that nobody could dispute his orders. He instantly created a new rule. If you do not work, you do not eat. This quote is straight out of the Bible, and he actually carried it out. For a short time, Jamestown thrived. They had tons of crops, hogs, and chickens planted and stored for the following winter. Also a side note, remember those 10 Polish and Dutchmen that betrayed him? It took him quite a while, but he finally found out they betrayed him, and he took them back from the Indians, sentenced them to death, but with how short of manpower Jamestown was, he pardoned them for their treason. So a very generous man. All was looking good until the next round of supplies came in from London. And on top of supplies, they brought 300 new colonists and new leadership. The new colonists were good. They brought women and families, showing that the Virginia Company believed Jamestown was a survivable location. But the new leadership that came over was some of John Smith's old rivals who had quit years before. Remember the guys who wanted to hang John Smith right after he mutinied, and the people that kept sending him on his expeditions? Yeah, these guys are now back, and they're saying, oh, we're part of the original 7, we now can make decisions. So instantly, the politics of Jamestown turns chaotic again. John Smith knows he wouldn't be re-elected president, and he tries to make the best of his current presidency by serving out to the end of his year-long term, but none of the colonists want to work because they know John Smith is effectively powerless now that the counselors can just outvote him. So John Smith is demoralized. All of this hard work has pretty much turned out for nothing. It's all being squandered away. None of the other leaders like him. And finally, while taking a nap on a boat, the gunpowder on his belt accidentally sets fire. He wakes up, obviously in a daze. He jumps in the water to put the fire out, but it's too late. He already has horrible burns on his leg, and he was unable to stand up for the next couple of months. While he was powerless, the new council accused him of treason for a number of totally fake charges, and John Smith decided that he had enough of this trip and sailed home with the supply ship. So he just, upset, demoralized, decides to call it quits. That ends John Smith's most famous time of his life as the leader of Jamestown, but it does not end his life. He still has a few important things to accomplish. After all, he is only 30 years old at this point. John Smith makes it back to England, heals from his injuries in a little bit of time. Smith published a few writings about Jamestown in Virginia and makes some money, but soon decided that he was not ready to retire for a peaceful life. Coming home, he was demoralized due to how much the leadership of Jamestown despised his actions of him just trying to save the colony. But returning home, he made some important discoveries. Another ship filled with the actual leaders had been shipwrecked in Bermuda. They slowly repaired their ships, built new ones, and miraculously continued sailing to Jamestown. Aboard their ship was orders directly from the Virginia Company that John Smith was to remain a high-ranking leader in Jamestown. He would have been about the 3rd in command. So the leaders that pretty much kicked him out of Jamestown were acting outside of the orders of the Virginia Company. This reassured John Smith because it proved that everyone back home still thought John Smith a competent and successful leader. Also, that next winter, Jamestown goes through its hardest time yet, known as the starving time. There was kind of the mini starving time where John Smith got them through, but this would be really bad, like eating shoe leather bad, because that was the best food they had, their own shoes. Granted, there were many reasons the colonists were low on food, but had John Smith stayed, it can be assumed, based on how he handled the previous year's starving time, that it would not have been near as destructive with his hard-handed leadership. With a new sense of morale and purpose, John Smith wanted to make another mark on history, and that would be to start his own colony from scratch. He wanted to make a northern colony that could be a harbor for all of the English fishing and whaling ships in the area of like the northeast part of America. He would also have his colonists trap animals for fur, cut down trees and timber to build ships. And he's like, this could be a very successful colony. So he did a scouting trip to this location to find a good location, and he called the entire region New England. And that is a term that we still use today. And it means the geographic location in the Northeast United States, like Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. All those states are considered the New England region of America. He also mapped the region, and when he returned home, the trip had been a success. He then successfully convinced the Virginia Company to fund a small colonial venture to start a small village in New England. Now, if you know a little bit about history, you will know that it's the Pilgrims that start the second colony after Jamestown. And it's called Plymouth, Plymouth Rock. Knowing that, we know something is going to go wrong for him not to be able to start his colony. And it is going to be two things of bad luck that strike John Smith. First, they arrive in New England, but then they get robbed by French pirates. John Smith gets taken prisoner and is abandoned by his own ship because they're like, hey, everything just got stolen from us. John Smith still wants to start this colony. We don't think it's going to work out well with no supplies. So they abandon him to the French and just go home. He has to escape on his own and does successfully escape the French. He returns to England. He says, Virginia Company, let me try again. The French messed us up. Let's try again. And the ship, they get a ship to sail, and they have to wait 3 months for a favorable wind that never comes. It's too expensive to wait around. The Virginia Company calls off John Smith's New England colony. Now, 3 months waiting for the right wind, it seems clear that there might be divine intervention preserving this New England territory for the Pilgrims. When the Pilgrims do decide to start a colony in New England a couple of years later, they do not take John Smith along with them. Smith definitely would have been the best person for the job, but as you can tell, he kind of has a reputation for being hard-handed, which would not have matched the Pilgrims' temperaments. So the Pilgrims will hire Captain Miles Standish instead of John Smith, and that is who my next lesson will be on. Something else Captain John Smith does in this rather chaotic lull of his life is visit Pocahontas. She ended up marrying a man named John Rolfe, and he is the man who made Jamestown rich by having the plantations mass farm tobacco, and it becomes known as a cash crop, very profitable. After John Smith left Jamestown many years ago, Indian relations turned sour and conflict broke out. At one point, Pocahontas was captured and taken prisoner, and she was being held ransom to be exchanged for English prisoners. The exchange never happened, and she lived for years with the English, learned the language, converted to Christianity, and eventually married John Rolfe. She probably would have been 16 or 17 when she got married. As a way to stir excitement for Virginia, the Virginia Company had Pocahontas and John Rolfe come to England and do a tour. It's almost like a publicity tour, almost like what actors do before movies nowadays to generate hype for the movie. They met the King and Queen, King James, and other notable people in England. John Smith was able to see her, and Pocahontas had very sweet things to say to him and said that she would always respect the way he treated her while he was in Virginia. But tragically, the story ends that after this meeting, while waiting for a ship to go back to Virginia, Pocahontas is going to die of disease at the age of 21. For the final part of John Smith's life, he does not go on any extreme adventures. He still has his connections with the Virginia Company, so he becomes a promoter or a propagandist for them. So he pretty much writes books to get people interested in supporting the colonization of the Americas. So now I'm going to wrap up and summarize John Smith's life because that's what he does in these books. And he wrote a lot about himself and his beliefs in general. He told his own story, proving that he was a tough and competent leader. He wrote that experience was more important than social class in America. He said people back in England should not be making decisions for people that are living in the challenging times of America. And this is very similar to the arguments that our founding fathers will make 140 years later during the Revolutionary War. He said political squabbles were the fastest way to destroy a starting colony. He said that the English had to be tough when dealing with the Indians. This was proven by John Smith always having successful but tense negotiations with them, but as soon as he leaves, relations descend into a proper war. This is partly because the English would lie instead of drawing hard lines. They'd tell the Indians what they want to hear. Yes, we'll give you guns, and then never give them guns. John Smith would just straight up say, nope, we're never giving you guns. He said that gold would not be Virginia's wealth, a correct prediction. He endorsed farming as a way to make the colonies profitable, another correct prediction. It took Jamestown a few decades to follow this advice, but once they started taking his advice, he was, vindicated. He also made sure the people of Jamestown participated in their daily prayers and attended church services on Sunday, showing that, if you're doing all this without Christianity, there's not a good point to it. Lastly, I will mention that John Smith was one of the few voices speaking out against the white slave trade. I have another video on this, but pretty much a majority of the servants who went to America were just slaves with a fancier title. When he was leader of Jamestown, he didn't like them because you had to force them to work, which was more work than it was actually worth. But later in life, he condemned it on moral grounds, saying white people should not treat each other like this. They should treat each other better. And, a white person should not treat another white person like disposable property. John Smith died of natural causes at the age of 51 in the year 1631. Tragically, he never married, so he did not have an heir to pass his lineage and blood onto, but he was survived by his sister. If you just read basic articles about John Smith, he has a reputation for being arrogant and lying to make himself seem more important than he really was. But upon reading deeper biographies, when the history is checked, John Smith is guilty of exaggerating his stories, which was completely normal for the time period. But there has never been anything that has proven John Smith a liar, meaning there is not one source that debunks an event or a person or a conversation that Smith wrote down. To conclude, I will leave you with a quote from John Smith about his vision for English colonization. "For my own part, I cannot choose but grieve, if the actions of an Englishman should not be as great as any monarchy that ever was since the world began. I mean, not as tyrants to torment Christians, but to suppress her disturbers, and to conquer her enemies." Thank you.